Join me today as we discuss what is the ROI for compliance and fraud prevention programs.
Hello, fellow fraud fighters. I'm your host, Alexis C for FraudCast. Today we're talking with attorney Susan Walberg about the ROI for compliance and fraud prevention programs. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Alexis. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. So I know you and I were talking before, and why is the return on investment even a conversation regarding compliance programs? Do companies really want to get in trouble from the regulatory side or have fraud and abuse problems? Help me understand that.
Sure. I think the underlying issue here is that a lot of leaders just don't think they really have a problem, and they don't believe it. So, most leaders will tell you that they have a good, solid, reputable organization. They have great staff, and their staff really care about in our case with healthcare, the patients and the work that they're doing. They're living the mission, and they just don't really think it's an issue. So that's a big piece. Another big piece is the fact that it's a cost center. Fraud and compliance are cost centers that suck away the money that could be better spent, for instance, on marketing or product development or a new business relationship. So they really perceive, first of all, there's no problem, and second of all, why would I want to spend all this money for something I don't really need? Because, we have a good organization. And then the last piece has to do with how the compliance and fraud programs cost money. They bring bad news. And when I say cost money, I don't mean just the salaries like I was talking about a minute ago, but they're the ones that come to you and say, we have an overpayment. We have to write a check to the government. They're the ones that tell the marketing department they have to stop this or that practice because it's not really ethical, legal, appropriate, or whatever. So we're the bad news guys, and we cost money, and we're not really necessary anyway because the company is good. So that's, I think, really the overall general rationale. I actually had an executive once when I was in my attorney capacity explaining. I had a regulation I was explaining to him, and he said, I just don't see that as cost effective. So compliance is not cost effective. Really, that's how it's perceived in some cases.
Wow, interesting. So how would you say that those perceptions are inaccurate?
I guess the bottom line is you can't prove a negative. So just because you don't know there's a problem doesn't mean there isn't one. And I would argue that if you have a program in place, you're more likely to know of a problem. If you don't have a program, you may not know until it comes and bites you, and the government is the one sending you that little letter or coming and paying you a visit. So just that whole not knowing is not really indicative that there's no problem. Another thing is compliance programs can actually bring in money. And thinking of a couple of examples, for instance, if you have a very strong program for auditing and monitoring documentation, coding, and billing, compliance programs do find money sometimes that's not being billed or it's being undercoded. With a lot of the concern and fear over government audits, sometimes providers are undercoding just because it's like defensive medicine, right? It's just safer to do that. And sometimes there's just errors, an outdated charge master or something like that. We might not even be billing for something we could be. Compliance programs do catch that. Another area is around the financial arrangements. So if an organization is paying higher than fair market value because they want to bring in, the best doctors, they shouldn't be paying for more than fair market value. And I think the compliance program helps them to keep that in line or in check. might be controversial because obviously there's a tension between wanting to bring in the best doctors that are going to bring in referrals, which of course you can't pay for that, right? That's why the government wants fair market value, but the compliance program will say you need to keep it within fair market value. You can't pay this guy in the 95th percentile along with every other guy. Like, you might be able to now and then defend that, but so it really is a lot of extra spend that organizations are doing that get kind of put under control, I guess, by the compliance program. So that's another big one. And then another one that people don't always think about is business opportunities and other people that you work with, whether it's in a merger or an acquisition situation or bringing in a vendor. If you're not doing due diligence on those organizations, you can end up with a lot of liabilities, whether it's a vendor that causes some sort of a major breach, or it's taking on a practice that's got a whole bunch of compliance problems that are going to end up resulting in fines, penalties, and a whole bunch of lawyer fees. Those are things that the compliance program and the fraud program, they can detect those things before you're too far into the relationship and before you're already going to be in trouble with those costs.
I think that's an excellent point. One of the things that I help organizations with when they're considering M&A activity, that mergers and acquisitions, is I'll run a financial statement analysis on the company they're looking to acquire and see if there's risk for fraud based on the financial statements. It was one of my earlier books that I wrote. So I think that is an absolute value to that, especially if, all of a sudden you're thinking that this organization is going to bring you a lot of money into your portfolio, and then you find out, oops, the majority of that money is walking out the door, then, or at least there's a high risk for that, then absolutely, I think that is something that organizations should be doing regarding the fraud prevention, getting that help on the M&A side, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say are the actual costs and benefits to the programs?
Okay, well, I did some research on this because this is frankly, I've had this question come up a lot of times, not only from executives, but also from new compliance officers who are having to explain this also to their executives. The certified fraud examiners estimate that corporations lose an average of 5% of their revenue a year on fraud. So, not being a numbers person, I'm going to do a little bit of math here. So if you have an organization with 200 million in revenues, and I'm just picking that number because it's an easy number to work with, and I'm not a math person. If you have 2 million in revenues, that's $1 million a year in fraud. Mm-hmm. So there's the cost right there. That's pretty simple to understand. Also, to think about the fraud recoupments. The government last year in 2015, the Department of Justice, and this is healthcare fraud, brought in $2.4 billion and opened 983 new fraud cases. So when you think about that number, both of those numbers actually, but the 983 in particular, that's not just the, backwoods organized crime type of organizations. Some of these, and I would argue probably most of these, were organizations where the executive would have sat in a room and said, we have a fine organization and our people would never do these things. And they believe that. They're not dishonest people. As you know, fraud and compliance problems happen in a whole different variety of circumstances. So 983 fraud cases, that's 983 organizations that went through a really, really bad time. And probably most of them didn't see it coming. So when you talk about the cost side, that's another one. And then there was another study done, and this one looked at, it's like 46 or 48 very large international organizations, and they looked at the cost of compliance versus the cost of non-compliance. And the compliance cost was 3.5 million, and the non-compliance was 9.4 million. That's a huge variance. And when you think about it, compliance costs, so you've got salaries, you've got, the various things compliance programs do. Non-compliance costs, on the other hand, and I can't emphasize this enough, it's more than just the 4 million settlement that you see in the headlines. This case maybe goes on for 3 or 4 years, and maybe longer. Some of these cases go a lot longer, in fact, and you've got lawyers that whole time that are working on the case. You're probably bringing in some consultants to help shore up your processes. And if you're not, you probably should be. And all of that adds up, not to mention the lost business and potentially, the headlines on the newspaper that paints you as a bad actor and costs you business relationships, patients, clients, or what have you. So that's the non-compliance costs. And they're a lot higher than what people see in the headlines. And I guess that's one of the key points. So those are the things on the cost side for what you can lose if you do not have the compliance program in place. Those are the bad things in the fraud and compliance programs.
I wanted to mention that I think that sometimes organizations underestimate the impact of the negative reputation. For example, I wrote a paper a number of years ago about a company called Water Basin. You can look them up. This was a public company that they merely had allegations of fraud, and over time they got delisted, and then eventually they completely went out of business. After the court was completely finished, they found, in fact, that there was not fraud. So it was just on the allegations of fraud, and a large public company completely went under. So I think that organizations absolutely underestimate the impact of that reputation impact when there's fraud.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. And some of these things, like a data breach, a data breach, not technically fraud, but you have that fear of identity theft. And it's, the average cost of one of those is close to $4 million. And that is one of those things where you're perceived as being it's a moral failing when you lose people's personal data. It's not just a business issue to people, to patients, to people whose financial information is gone who knows where. And when you think of those costs, you think of also, people are going to sue you. And it's not just the government. If you're a patient and you think that your identity is being stolen because these guys lost your stuff, or maybe one of their business associates lost your data, that's going to very quickly become a headline, and it's going to be the moral failing of your organization. It is perceived that way. It's perceived, there's a trust problem there, and you just can't understate that. So absolutely. So when you look at all of that, and you look at what does it actually cost to have a program in place to hopefully mitigate those things happening. I mean, you're never going to totally eliminate the chances of it, but in looking at the Healthcare Compliance Association ran some numbers, and they do a regular salary survey and the cost of compliance programs. And for 2015, the most recent one they did showed that more than half were spending less than $250,000 for the compliance program. So that's more than half of the organizations, and granted, it's all different sizes, so that's really an average. But when you look at the earlier example of a $200 million in revenue and $1 million lost in fraud, if they're spending $250,000 on their compliance program, I mean, that's a pretty good return on investment. Even someone who's not a math person like me can figure that out. So, I mean, I'm just saying, that's a pretty clear example. A lot of companies aren't that big and just have a compliance officer. They don't have the whole huge department. So one compliance officer could be 100,000. Higher end is 200,000. That's usually a large organization, so probably been the 120 to 150 for a good qualified person to manage those programs. So that's not a huge amount of money when you look at some of these horrific numbers around the settlements and the bad press and the lawyer fees and all of that. It starts to look a little bit more attractive when you actually look at that math. So yeah, I would say that's the return on investment. And obviously every organization is a different size and different incidents cost different amounts. But even just saying the 5% as a baseline. So even if you don't have any huge incidents, if you've got a standard kind of 5% loss, unless you're pretty small, and you can justify having a compliance or fraud person.
I agree. And another consideration as a benefit is that the deterrence factor. If you took a bell curve of people, just in general, excuse me, I specialize in insider threat. So we know that, on the one tail, people will never steal no matter what. Excuse me. And then on the other side, people will always steal. They walk into your organization hoping to be able to steal from you. So you have about 80% of the people that, given events, sort of event-driven, given the opportunity, you have a weakness in your internal controls, given something that has happened to them, whether they're first day on the job or 20 years in, some of these people are sort of on the fence. Am I going to steal today? Am I not? Like, their pressure's really there. All of these various different rationalizations are going on in their mind. I truly believe, and I've seen in the past, that if you have a robust compliance program and a fraud prevention program, it will be the deterrent to make those people decide, yeah, I'm not going to do it. It's not going to be worth it. Somebody's watching, because they don't truly know all the things that we look at, and they're not really, really sure of the data analysis capabilities that we have in these kinds of things. And so they think, I will probably get caught, so I'm not going to do it. And it's those people that are on the fence that just by nature of having a compliance program, they're not going to do it. So I think that can't be overlooked as well. There's that big deterrence factor.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things. Mm-hmm. When you take a job and they say, that the IT, nothing is private, that they can monitor you. Even that alone, and then when they have a compliance and fraud program, they know that someone may be watching. So I think that when you look at those 80% that are maybe not fraudsters, I think that having that program is going to go a long way. And then the other thing that we've talked about before is the whole government effort now to look at individual wrongdoing in the context of a corporate case, whether it's civil or criminal. The Attorney General has basically said, you're going after the individuals too. We're not just going to go after the corporation. We're requiring you, civil or criminal, to go after the wrongdoings of individuals. I think that that's one area where there's room for a lot of education, and that's also a deterrent, because, if I'm the individual, I don't want that to be me. I sure don't want that to be me. And, who's going to end up being that individual? It's probably not going to be the executives if they have anything to say about it. They will be motivated to try and find the actual person who had their hands in it, because everyone's going to start wanting to save their own bacon. And yeah, I just think that can't be overstated.
I think that's an excellent point. So you're referring to the Yates memo. You and I talked about that before. I think we should do an entire segment just on the impact of the Yates memo and that change, because we saw in the past where sort of the public perception is that, oh, it's white collar crime, nobody's getting hurt. I have many thoughts about that. And people were not going to jail and all of these different things. But now it has really, really shifted, especially with this Yates memo and this directive that, hey, not only is it going to be the organization where you're going to have monetary fines and sanctions and all these other things, but now specifically marching orders to go after the individuals. I think that is an excellent point.
Yeah,
it's a game changer.
It is, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of it yet. I mean, people in your industry and my industry are, but the average people are not. And I think that it's an area that's ripe for a lot more education, and it may have a really strong deterrence effect. So I guess those are the main things, in terms of looking at the actual cost benefit. And I guess then the last point is, when you think about an ethical organization and one that's kind of keeping its nose clean, so to speak, that really helps with your employees' morale and productivity. Some of those intangibles that, if you tell someone who wants an ROI, they might kind of shrug at you when you say that, but those things do matter, as does your reputation in the industry. And that can cost you business deals, can cost you customers. So there's a lot of things that are a little less tangible that really make a material difference to your business.
That's an excellent point. So how would you say that, given all of the risks that executives and management need to be concerned with compliance programs and with fraud prevention programs, and all of those risks that they need to speak to, how can they effectively have a budget to be able to manage that risk?
That's a great point. There's so many things as a compliance person that, now they add something new every year, right? Now we're supposed to be on top of quality issues, and we're supposed to be on top of things that relate to HR or the environment. Where do you draw that line, and how in the world does, especially if you've got one person, how do you do that? And it's really a risk-based approach, and it has to be, because if you don't find a way to identify where the high risks are and target those things, you are wasting your resources, and you may be missing out on the most important things. So in the past, back in the good old days, we used to look at the OIG's work plan, and that was what compliance officers, it was almost the Bible for your annual risk assessment. Like, what's the OIG looking at this year, and which of those things affect my organization? And then maybe they survey managers with that list of things. You know, how do you rate the risk, high, medium, low, yada, yada. And that was how they did a risk assessment, which is better than nothing, to be sure. But things have really evolved to the point where you want to look at the whole environment, both internally and externally. You want to look at what's going on, what are new laws and regulations that affect your industry, what are the enforcement trends. And that's not just the OIG work plan, that's like what's in the headlines, what are you reading in your listservs, you know. I follow Health Lawyers, Compliance Association, and a myriad of others. What are you seeing there? What's the trends? And sometimes you see trends that you don't see on the OIG work plan, and it's just things that seem to be happening. So all of that on the outside, and then on the inside, what do your hotline calls look like? What are your just internal reviews looking like? Not just the compliance office, but internal audit. What are they finding? What are you hearing from the quality folks? You know, quality can have a big, I mean, it's become a healthcare fraud issue, right? Because they're looking at if you're putting a patient in a bed when you shouldn't be. Well, that's a quality question. So, but now it's a fraud question. So there's a lot of overlap, and you really need to be cued into all of those sorts of things to get an accurate picture. And then the other thing is, you need to have a relationship in the organization, because a lot of the stuff that's going to come up that gets identified is not going to be identified by you as the fraud or compliance person. It's going to be some employee who sees something that just doesn't seem right, raises a concern. They might even go to HR, they might come to you, they might go to their boss, unless their boss is the one they think is doing it. If you have that relationship in the organization where they will come and talk to you, and where you have positioned yourself as a resource, as a positive person in the company to protect the people there, to protect the organization from harm, and to help them find the correct way of doing what they want to do, but in a way that's not going to get them into trouble. And if you create that kind of persona, you're a lot more likely to have these things coming to you that help you really assess where your risks are, and help you really kind of have your ear to the ground and understand what's happening. So, I mean, I can't overstate the role that you have to play in the organization as a support role and not as a police role. Obviously, there's times when the police role has to come out, but for the most part, you're going to get a whole lot more help doing your job when people bring things to you and are comfortable to do that.
That is an excellent point. Well, do you have any last thoughts for us today?
Just a couple kind of summary, I guess. One is for people to really understand that the settlement costs that you see bear very little relationship to the true cost of what a bad incident can cost for a person or a company, in terms of the lawyers and the lack of trust with relationships and stakeholders. That's really the biggest one. When you look at the cost of a compliance or fraud program compared to those, is minimal. And I'd say, so that's the ultimate ROI on that, is, you know, you can't even compare the two. So I would say that it's kind of a no-brainer. I tried to bring in some numbers today to at least paint a bit of a picture. It's a question that comes up all the time, and it's a very hard one for people in our fields to answer. But I'm hoping that gave a little bit of more teeth to it and a little bit more data.
Yeah, I think what I'm left with is we can't afford not to do it.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and it looks like you and I have many other segments that we need to address and talk about. So we'll talk about that offline. But thank you again. It was an absolute sincere pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you again for inviting me.
Okay. Have a great day. Bye.
You too. Thanks.
To reach out to Susan, email her at swalberg@kohlerhc.com.